The funniest secret is the one everyone notices except the people trying to keep it. That thought never crossed my mind on the first Saturday Noah and I officially called each other boyfriends. In fact, we were both completely convinced that we were doing an excellent job acting normal. Looking back now, I almost have to laugh at how confident we sounded. Noah met me outside my apartment just after 8 in the morning, dressed in his usual navy jacket after finishing an overnight shift at the hospital. He looked tired, but the moment he saw me, his entire expression softened into the familiar smile that had somehow become my favorite part of every weekend. Before anyone else could notice, we silently agreed on the same unspoken rule we had discussed the night before. We would keep our relationship private for now. No dramatic announcements. No awkward conversations. Just the two of us quietly enjoying what we had finally found together. Ready for breakfast? Noah asked. Always, I answered with a grin. We drove to the little neighborhood cafe where we had shared countless conversations long before either of us admitted how we felt. Everything looked exactly the same. The old brick walls, the wooden tables beside the windows, the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls drifting through the air. Yet somehow the entire place felt different because now every ordinary moment carried a new meaning. While we waited in line, I reached for my wallet, but Noah gently stopped me. My turn, he said. You paid last weekend. I smiled. You actually remembered. I remember almost everything about you. The words slipped out naturally, and for a second we both froze before quietly laughing. An older woman waiting behind us smiled as she watched the exchange. You two are adorable, she said warmly before walking toward another table. My face immediately grew warm. Noah simply thanked her politely as though nothing unusual had happened. Once we sat near the window, I leaned forward across the table. Do you think she knew? Noah stirred his coffee calmly. Knew what? About us. He looked thoughtfully toward the window before smiling. I think she saw two people enjoying breakfast. I let out a relieved breath. Exactly. We convinced ourselves that nothing had happened. After breakfast, we wandered through the local farmer's market, stopping to sample homemade jam, fresh apples, and warm bread from family-owned stands. Noah absent-mindedly brushed a loose strand of hair away from my forehead while we examined a basket of peaches. The movement was so quick and natural that neither of us reacted until the vendor smiled knowingly. You two make a wonderful couple, he said while placing another peach into our bag. Noah thanked him with perfect composure. I nearly dropped the fruit. As we walked away, I lowered my voice. That is the second person today. Noah chuckled softly. Coincidence? You think? I think people enjoy making assumptions. I nodded because that explanation sounded reasonable enough. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. We visited a bookstore, shared one oversized cookie from our favorite bakery, and spent nearly an hour sitting together in the park watching children chase pigeons across the grass. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing that felt obvious. Yet every now and then I noticed strangers smiling at us before continuing on their way. Late that evening, Noah walked me to my apartment building. We paused beneath the warm glow of the porch light, careful to keep a respectful distance because neighbors often passed by. I think we did pretty well today, I whispered confidently. Noah laughed under his breath. I think so too. Just then my elderly neighbor opened her front door to water the flowers lining the walkway. She glanced from Noah to me, smiled with unmistakable affection, and said, It is so nice seeing you boys this happy together. Before either of us could answer, she continued watering her flowers as though she had simply commented on the weather. Noah looked at me. I looked back at him. Then, for the first time since we decided to keep our relationship secret, we both began wondering whether our secret had ever really been hidden at all. Monday morning quietly reminded me that keeping a secret was much harder than falling in love. I arrived on campus carrying my usual backpack, a cup of coffee in one hand and a roll of architectural sketches in the other, determined to focus on classes instead of replaying every strange moment from the weekend. The elderly woman at my apartment, the vendor at the farmer's market, the smile from the woman in the cafe. Noah and I had agreed that nobody knew about us. Yet somehow complete strangers kept looking at us as though they had already figured everything out. I shook my head and laughed to myself. Maybe we were simply overthinking everything. My phone buzzed just before my first lecture. Good luck on your presentation today. Remember to breathe. Noah. A smile appeared before I even realized it. I quickly typed back. Thank you. Try to get some sleep after your shift. His reply came almost instantly. Only if you promise to eat lunch. I slipped my phone into my pocket, still smiling as I walked into the classroom. During the presentation, my professor complimented my latest design project, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely confident standing in front of everyone. As class ended, my friend Emily caught up with me outside the building. "Someone looks unusually happy today," she said with a playful grin. "Do I?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Definitely." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "You have been smiling at your phone a lot lately." I laughed nervously. "Probably because life has been less stressful." "Maybe," she replied, sounding unconvinced. "Or maybe someone is making your mornings better." Before I could answer, she simply smiled and changed the subject, leaving me wondering whether she had actually noticed something or was only teasing me. Later that afternoon, I met Noah outside the hospital where his shift had finally ended. We had planned nothing more exciting than grabbing sandwiches and taking a short walk through the nearby park before he went home to rest. It sounded wonderfully ordinary, exactly the kind of afternoon both of us loved. Noah looked exhausted when he stepped through the hospital entrance, yet the moment he saw me, his shoulders relaxed. "Long day?" I asked. "Very," he admitted with a tired smile. Without thinking, I reached up and gently straightened the slightly crooked collar of his jacket. It was such a small gesture that I barely noticed doing it until Noah looked at me with quiet affection. "Thank you," he said softly. We continued walking toward the park, neither of us mentioning the moment again. Halfway through lunch, Noah absent-mindedly pushed the pickle from his sandwich onto my plate because he knew I liked them and he never did. I laughed. "You still remember that? You have hated tomatoes since you were 16 and always steal my pickles," he answered. "Some habits never change." We smiled at each other, completely forgetting that we were sitting on a public bench surrounded by people enjoying the afternoon sunshine. As we stood to leave, an older man walking his golden retriever paused beside us. He smiled warmly before pointing toward the untouched tomatoes now sitting on Noah's plate. 42 years, he said proudly. "My husband still gives me his onions, and I still give him my pickles." Funny how love always looks the same in the little things. Before either of us could respond, he continued down the path with his dog happily wagging its tail beside him. Noah looked at me with raised eyebrows. I blinked in disbelief. "That makes 4 people," I whispered. Noah laughed quietly, but this time even he seemed less certain that everyone else was simply guessing. As we walked beneath the shade of the maple trees, I realized our relationship had changed us in countless tiny ways that neither of us had ever tried to hide. Because the smallest acts of caring often speak much louder than the biggest secrets. Friday evening arrived with the familiar comfort of family dinner, something Liam insisted everyone should never skip whenever schedules allowed. Noah had accepted the invitation without hesitation, and although he had eaten at our house countless times before, everything felt slightly different now that only the two of us knew the truth about our relationship. At least we believed only the two of us knew. My mother greeted Noah with the same warm hug she always gave him before disappearing into the kitchen to check on dinner. Liam was setting the table while joking about one of his coworkers, and the entire house felt comfortably ordinary. I quietly reminded myself that ordinary was exactly what we wanted. Noah stood beside me carrying a bowl of salad from the kitchen, and before I even reached for it, he shifted it naturally into my hands because he knew I always preferred carrying lighter dishes while he handled the heavier ones. The movement lasted only a second, yet it happened with the effortless rhythm of people who had learned each other's habits without thinking. "Thanks," I said softly. "You are welcome," Noah replied with an easy smile. Liam glanced toward us for the briefest moment before returning to arrange the plates, though I noticed the corner of his mouth lift almost imperceptibly. During dinner, the conversation wandered from my architecture classes to Noah's latest hospital rotation. My father asked several questions about a community health project, while my mother insisted everyone take another helping of mashed potatoes. Everything felt relaxed until I reached for the pepper grinder at exactly the same moment Noah quietly slid it toward me before I even asked. "You always forget that," he said casually. "Forget what?" I asked. "You always add pepper after tasting the first bite." I looked at him, surprised. "You remember that?" He shrugged. "Of course." The table grew strangely quiet for a heartbeat before Liam chuckled into his glass of iced tea. "That is an impressive memory," he said with a grin that somehow sounded more amused than curious. My face warmed immediately. We spend a lot of time together. I answered a little too quickly. That is true, Noah added calmly. The conversation moved on, but I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. After dinner, my mother asked Noah to help carry dessert into the living room while I washed a few dishes. As I stood at the sink, Liam quietly walked over beside me and picked up a towel to dry the plates. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. You seem happy lately. I smiled without looking up. I am. Happier than usual. I laughed nervously. Is it that obvious? Liam did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed another clean plate into the cabinet before speaking again. Sometimes people think they are hiding something because they never say it out loud. He glanced toward the living room where Noah was laughing with our parents. But happiness has a funny way of introducing itself. My hands paused beneath the warm running water. What do you mean? Liam smiled to himself. Nothing important. Then he changed the subject completely by asking about one of my studio projects, leaving me even more confused than before. Later that evening, Noah walked me to the front porch before heading home. The cool night air carried the scent of freshly cut grass while porch lights glowed across the quiet neighborhood. Your brother seemed thoughtful tonight, I said. Noah nodded slowly. I noticed. Do you think he suspects anything? Noah looked toward the stars before smiling with gentle reassurance. If he does, he has not treated us any differently. I wanted to believe him, yet Liam's words echoed quietly in my mind all the way back inside the house. Sometimes people think they are hiding something because they never say it out loud. As I closed the front door behind me, I could not help wondering whether the people who loved us had been reading the truth in our smallest gestures long before either Noah or I ever found the courage to admit it ourselves. The weekend arrived with the kind of bright autumn weather that always seemed to invite everyone outdoors. Noah had finally finished a demanding stretch of hospital shifts, and after several days of coordinating schedules, we agreed to meet our friends at the annual Community Harvest Festival downtown. It sounded like the safest possible plan. There would be music, local food vendors, craft booths, and hundreds of people moving from one attraction to another. If Noah and I wanted to avoid attracting attention, a crowded festival seemed like the perfect place to disappear into the background. At least that was the theory. We met Emily and a few friends near the entrance beneath rows of colorful banners swaying gently in the breeze. Emily greeted both of us with a cheerful wave before immediately handing me a warm apple cider. I already bought one for you, she said with a knowing smile. Before I could thank her, Noah reached over without hesitation, slipped the paper sleeve higher around the cup so it would not burn my hand, and smiled as though he had done nothing unusual. Emily watched the tiny gesture for barely a second before hiding an amused grin behind her own drink. We spent the afternoon wandering through handmade craft displays, tasting fresh caramel popcorn, and listening to a local jazz band performing near the town square. Everything felt relaxed until we stopped beside a booth selling personalized keychains. The artist looked up from her work and asked casually, "Would you like matching designs?" My face warmed instantly. "We are just looking," I answered a little too quickly. Noah smiled politely, thanked her, and guided us toward the next booth without saying another word. A few minutes later, Emily caught up with us while trying very hard not to laugh. "You two have become surprisingly synchronized lately," she said. "Have we?" I asked. "You finish each other's sentences, walk at exactly the same pace, and somehow always notice when the other person needs something before they even ask." I exchanged a quick glance with Noah before looking back at her. That probably happens when people have known each other for years. Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe." She smiled again, but there was a quiet certainty behind her expression that made me wonder how much she truly understood. As the afternoon faded into evening, everyone gathered near the outdoor stage where strings of warm lights slowly illuminated the park. A local photographer was taking complimentary group pictures for families and friends enjoying the festival. "Come on," Marcus called. Everyone together. We lined up naturally, and without thinking, Noah stepped beside me while I instinctively moved closer so everyone would fit comfortably into the frame. The photographer adjusted the camera for a moment before smiling warmly. "Perfect," she said. "You two stay exactly where you are?" Couples usually look the most natural standing like that. Time seemed to pause for a heartbeat. I felt my pulse quicken as I glanced toward Noah, expecting at least a hint of surprise. Instead, he remained calm, his expression gentle and relaxed. Emily looked down, pretending to examine her phone while unsuccessfully hiding a smile. Marcus quietly cleared his throat, and even the photographer seemed unaware that she had said anything unusual. The picture was taken a second later, and everyone thanked her before walking away together. As we continued toward the parking lot beneath the glowing festival lights, I finally whispered, "That keeps happening." Noah looked at me with the same peaceful smile that had always steadied my thoughts. "Maybe," he replied softly, "people are simply seeing what has always been there." His words lingered with me long after the music faded behind us, because for the first time I began wondering whether our secret had never depended on silence at all, but on whether we were finally ready to accept that the people who cared about us had quietly understood our hearts long before we did. By the middle of the following week, I had almost convinced myself that Noah and I were imagining everything. Maybe the comments from strangers were nothing more than friendly observations. Maybe Emily's smiles carried no hidden meaning. Maybe Liam's quiet remarks were simply the kind of thoughtful conversations he always enjoyed. Repeating those ideas to myself made it easier to concentrate on school, even if a small voice in the back of my mind no longer believed them completely. Thursday afternoon, Noah texted me just before 1 o'clock. "I have a 2-hour break before my evening shift. Meet me at Riverside Park?" I smiled immediately. "Sounds perfect. I will bring lunch." 30 minutes later, I found him waiting beneath the same large maple tree where we had spent countless afternoons talking long before we became a couple. The leaves had begun turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and a gentle breeze carried them across the walking paths like tiny pieces of autumn floating through the sunlight. Noah looked tired from another demanding week at the hospital, but the moment he saw me, the exhaustion in his expression softened into quiet happiness. "You actually remembered my favorite sandwich," he said, as I handed him the paper bag. "Turkey, Swiss cheese, no tomatoes," I answered with a smile. "Some habits never change." He laughed warmly. "Apparently not." We settled onto our usual bench overlooking the river, enjoying the comfortable silence that had always been one of the strongest parts of our friendship. The conversation drifted effortlessly from my architecture studio project to one of Noah's patients who had finally recovered enough to return home. Nothing dramatic happened. It was simply another ordinary afternoon, and somehow those ordinary afternoons had become the moments I treasured most. After lunch, we decided to walk along the river trail. As we crossed a small wooden bridge, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and frowned. Emily had sent a message to our group chat. "Coffee tonight. Everyone is coming." Noah glanced at the screen. "Are we going?" "Of course," I replied. "Act normal, remember?" He smiled playfully. "I thought we had been acting normal." I laughed. "That is exactly what worries me." Later that evening, we met everyone at our favorite neighborhood coffee shop. Marcus was already telling an exaggerated story about getting lost on a hiking trail, while Emily and Olivia laughed so hard that people at nearby tables kept smiling in their direction. Noah and I slid naturally into our usual seats without thinking. The waitress approached almost immediately. "Good to see you both again," she said cheerfully before looking at Noah. "Chamomile tea for you after another hospital shift?" Then she turned toward me. "And the caramel latte with oat milk for him, right?" I blinked in surprise. "You remember our orders?" She laughed. "You two have been coming here together for years. Some things become easy to remember." She walked away before either of us could answer. Marcus leaned back in his chair with an amused grin. "She knows your orders better than I know my own." "That is because Noah always orders first," I said quickly. Emily stirred her coffee, trying not to smile. "Actually," she said casually, "he always waits until Ethan orders, just to make sure nothing has changed." I looked at Noah. He looked back at me with an expression that quietly admitted she was right. I had never noticed. Emily lifted her cup and smiled gently. "Funny the little things people notice when they care enough to pay attention." Her words settled over the table with surprising warmth rather than embarrassment. As the conversation moved on, I found myself looking at Noah differently. Maybe the real question had never been whether people knew our secret. Maybe the people who loved us had simply been watching two hearts slowly find each other, patiently waiting until we were finally ready to see what they had quietly seen all along. The question stayed with me for the rest of the week. Maybe our friends were not discovering a secret. Maybe they had simply been waiting for us to stop pretending there was nothing to discover. Even so, Noah and I never actually talked about making our relationship public. Neither of us felt rushed, and neither of us wanted to turn something deeply personal into an announcement. We were happy exactly where we were, enjoying quiet mornings, shared lunches, and ordinary conversations that somehow meant more than they ever had before. Saturday afternoon, Noah invited me to help him pick up a few things from the neighborhood grocery store before we planned to cook dinner together. It sounded wonderfully simple. We wandered through the produce section comparing vegetables, laughing over our completely different opinions about pasta sauce, and debating whether homemade bread was worth the extra effort. It absolutely is, Noah insisted while placing a fresh loaf into the shopping cart. You only say that because you like baking, I replied, and because you always eat half the loaf before dinner. I laughed because he was completely right. As we continued through the aisles, I reached automatically for Noah's shopping list when it slipped from his hand. He thanked me with a smile that felt so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. We checked out, packed our groceries, and walked toward the parking lot beneath a bright blue autumn sky. Just as Noah unlocked the car, I realized I had forgotten to buy coffee beans. I will be right back, I said. Stay here. 5 minutes later I returned carrying a small paper bag and immediately spotted Noah standing beside the car talking with my mother. My heart skipped for a moment. She smiled warmly the instant she saw me walking over. There you are, she said cheerfully. I ran into Noah while looking for your favorite coffee. I glanced at Noah, who looked perfectly calm, then back at my mother. Small world, I replied. She nodded with a knowing smile. It certainly is. As we loaded the groceries into the trunk, she casually looked inside the bags. You boys always shop together now. I felt my face grow warm. It is easier that way. I imagine it is, she answered gently. Then, before either of us could think too much about the conversation, she reached over and lightly adjusted the sleeve of Noah's jacket the same way she had done for years whenever she thought someone looked untidy. Take good care of each other, she said with quiet affection. Life is much happier when you have someone who remembers the little things. She smiled one last time before walking toward her own car. Noah and I stood silently beside the trunk for several seconds after she left. Finally, I turned toward him. Do you think that was another coincidence? Noah rested one hand on the shopping cart before smiling softly. I think your mother has always been very observant. We drove to my apartment without saying much, both replaying the conversation in our minds. Later that evening, while homemade pasta simmered on the stove and fresh bread baked in the oven, I found myself watching Noah move comfortably around the kitchen as though he had belonged there forever. He reached for 2 plates before I even asked, filled my glass with water because he noticed it was empty, and smiled when I quietly thanked him. Suddenly, I understood what everyone else had been seeing. Our relationship had never been revealed through dramatic moments. It had been written into hundreds of ordinary gestures that spoke with perfect honesty every single day. The secret we worked so carefully to protect was quietly reflected in every smile, every shared habit, and every effortless act of caring, making it less of a secret than a beautiful truth waiting for us to finally recognize. Sunday afternoon arrived with a quiet sense of peace that I had not fully appreciated until recently. Noah and I decided to spend the day at the botanical garden, where we had often escaped the noise of the city long before either of us admitted what our hearts already knew. The familiar walking paths curved through colorful autumn flowers, and the gentle sound of a nearby fountain blended with birds singing high in the trees. It felt like the perfect place to slow down and simply enjoy being together without thinking about whether anyone was watching. We carried 2 cups of coffee as we wandered through the gardens, stopping every few minutes whenever Noah noticed a flower he thought I would want to sketch for one of my architecture projects. You still see inspiration everywhere, he said with a smile. Only because you keep pointing it out first, I answered. He laughed quietly. That is not true. It is, I replied. You always notice the things that make me happy. Noah looked away for a brief moment, almost embarrassed by the compliment. Maybe I have had a lot of practice. We continued walking until we reached a small wooden bridge overlooking a peaceful pond. The reflection of red and golden leaves shimmered gently across the water while families strolled nearby enjoying the cool afternoon. Neither of us said very much. We never needed constant conversation to enjoy each other's company. As we leaned against the railing, I suddenly remembered something that had happened months earlier, long before we became a couple. Do you remember bringing me here after my final architecture review? I asked. Noah smiled immediately. You were convinced your presentation had gone terribly. It actually went well. I knew it would. I looked at him with curious amusement. You sounded just as confident back then. He nodded. Because I believed in you even when you did not. His answer settled warmly inside my heart. Looking back, I realized how many quiet moments like that had slowly built the foundation of everything we now shared. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. I was wondering if I would find you two here. We turned and saw Liam approaching along the path with 2 paper cups of coffee in his hands. He smiled as though this meeting had been the most natural thing in the world. Mind if I join you for a minute? Noah welcomed him with an easy smile, while I tried not to look nervous. Liam rested his arms lightly on the bridge railing beside us and admired the view before speaking again. Beautiful afternoon. It really is, Noah agreed. For a few peaceful moments, all 3 of us simply watched the sunlight dance across the pond. Then Liam looked toward me with the same calm expression he had worn during family dinner a week earlier. You know, he said thoughtfully, I have been meaning to tell you something. My heartbeat quickened. Noah remained completely relaxed beside me. Liam smiled gently before continuing. When people care about each other, they stop asking whether something is hidden. They start noticing whether the people they love are happy. I glanced at Noah before looking back at my brother. Liam chuckled softly. The truth is, I stopped wondering about you two a long time ago. He shook his head with quiet affection. Not because anyone told me anything. Because every time I saw you together, you looked like 2 people who had already found where they belonged. I felt every ounce of nervousness disappear. There was no disappointment in his voice, no surprise, and no judgment. There was only warmth. Liam smiled at both of us before taking a sip of his coffee. I was never waiting for an explanation, he said. I was only waiting until you were happy enough to stop worrying about whether the rest of us already knew. For several quiet moments, none of us spoke. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the bridge while sunlight shimmered gently over the pond. Liam's words settled into my heart with surprising comfort instead of the fear I had expected. I had spent so much time worrying about protecting a secret that I never stopped to ask whether the people who loved us actually needed an explanation. Liam smiled at both of us before setting his empty coffee cup on the nearby bench. Do you remember when you were 16? He asked me. I laughed softly. I try not to. You brought Noah home after one of your architecture competitions because you wanted his opinion before anyone else's. Noah smiled at the memory. You had already shown the project to your professors. Exactly, Liam continued. Then you asked Noah anyway. He looked at me with quiet amusement. Back then I thought you simply admired him. I lowered my eyes with an embarrassed smile. I did admire him. I know. Liam nodded gently. But over the years I noticed something else. Whenever something good happened, Noah was the first person you wanted to tell. Whenever something difficult happened, he was the first person you called. That kind of trust says more than words ever could. Noah stood quietly beside me, listening without interrupting. Liam turned toward him with the same warm expression. And you were not exactly difficult to read either. Noah raised an eyebrow playfully. Really? Really? Liam laughed. Every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday dinner, you somehow ended up helping Ethan before anyone else even realized he needed something. You remembered his favorite desserts, noticed when he was tired, and somehow always knew when he was pretending everything was fine. Noah rubbed the back of his neck with a shy smile. I thought I was being subtle. You were subtle, Liam replied. Just not invisible. We all laughed together, and for the first time the conversation felt wonderfully light. The nervousness that had followed me for weeks quietly disappeared. Instead of feeling exposed, I felt understood. We left the bridge together and wandered slowly through the garden paths, talking about old memories that suddenly carried entirely new meaning. Liam reminded us of road trips where Noah instinctively saved the window seat for me, family picnics where I always packed Noah's favorite snacks without thinking, and movie nights where everyone somehow expected us to sit beside each other. Looking back, each memory felt like another piece of a puzzle that had always been complete, even before Noah and I admitted what was in our hearts. As the afternoon drew to a close, Liam paused near the garden entrance before saying goodbye. He gave me a quick hug, then smiled warmly at Noah. Thank you, he said sincerely. Noah looked surprised. For what? For making my little brother this happy. Noah answered with quiet honesty. He has done the same for me. Liam nodded once, completely satisfied with that answer. After he walked away, Noah and I remained standing beneath the golden light filtering through the trees. I slipped my hands into my jacket pockets and let out a slow breath. I spent weeks worrying about everyone finding out, I admitted. Noah looked at me with the gentle smile that had always made every uncertainty feel smaller. And now, I glanced toward the path where Liam had disappeared before meeting Noah's eyes again. Now I think I was never afraid of people knowing. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. I was only afraid of imagining they might not understand. Noah nodded softly. Sometimes the people who love us understand long before we are ready to believe it ourselves. As we began walking toward the parking lot beneath the brilliant autumn sky, I realized that the weight I had been carrying had quietly disappeared, replaced by something far stronger than secrecy. It was the comforting certainty that real love does not become meaningful because it is hidden. It becomes meaningful because the people who truly care can recognize it, even in the smallest everyday moments. The following Saturday, Noah suggested we take a drive without deciding where we were going. No maps, he said with a smile as we pulled away from the city. Let the road make the decision. I laughed because that sounded exactly like him. Noah always believed that some of the best memories happened when life was allowed to unfold naturally instead of being planned down to the smallest detail. We spent the morning following quiet country roads lined with brilliant red and golden maple trees until we discovered a small lakeside town preparing for its annual autumn market. Families wandered between local shops, children carried warm apple cider, and musicians filled the air with soft acoustic melodies. It was peaceful, welcoming, and wonderfully ordinary. We parked near the town square and walked slowly through the streets, stopping whenever something caught our attention. Noah found a small bookstore and immediately disappeared into the history section while I admired a display of handmade journals created by local artists. When I finally joined him, he was already holding a novel that I had mentioned wanting to read months earlier. You remembered, I said, smiling. You always remember. Noah looked almost surprised by the question. Remembering the things that matter to you has never been difficult. His answer felt so simple, yet it carried the same quiet sincerity that had defined our relationship from the very beginning. Later that afternoon, we bought 2 cups of hot chocolate and walked toward the lake, where dozens of people were watching ducks glide peacefully across the water. An elderly couple sitting nearby smiled as we searched for an empty bench. You two remind us of ourselves, the woman said kindly. Still finishing each other's thoughts after all these years. Noah laughed softly before answering. We are still working on that. Her husband chuckled. Trust me, it only gets easier. They wished us a wonderful afternoon before continuing their walk together, hand in hand beneath the colorful trees. I watched them disappear along the shoreline before looking at Noah. A few weeks ago, I would have panicked after hearing something like that, I admitted. I know, Noah replied gently. And now? I looked around at the peaceful lake, the smiling families, and the quiet happiness surrounding us. Now it just feels nice. Noah smiled with unmistakable warmth. Because you finally stopped measuring our happiness by whether other people noticed it. I nodded slowly. I think I spent too much time believing love had to stay hidden until everything felt perfect. I looked down at the ripples spreading across the water. But nothing about us has ever depended on perfect timing. Noah reached over and lightly bumped my shoulder with his, the same playful gesture he had used for years. No, he agreed. It depended on trust. We remained there until the afternoon sunlight began fading into soft shades of orange. Before heading back to the car, we crossed a small wooden bridge overlooking the lake. I paused in the middle and smiled as another memory returned. Do you realize something? I asked. Noah leaned against the railing beside me. What? I laughed quietly. We spent so much energy trying to protect a secret that never really existed. Noah looked out across the calm water before meeting my eyes again. Maybe it existed, he said thoughtfully, just not in the way we imagined. What do you mean? His smile grew a little brighter. The only people who did not know how much we cared about each other were the 2 people standing on this bridge. I laughed so hard that several nearby birds lifted into the evening sky. Looking back over everything that had happened, I realized he was absolutely right. Everyone else had simply been patient enough to let us discover the truth in our own time. and somehow that made the ending of our story feel even more beautiful than the secret we had once worked so hard to keep. The weeks that followed felt lighter than any season I could remember. Nothing about the outside world had changed overnight, yet everything inside me had. I no longer caught myself wondering whether someone had noticed the way Noah and I naturally cared for each other. Instead, I found myself appreciating those little moments even more because they had become quiet reminders of everything we had built together over the years. One crisp Saturday morning, we volunteered at the neighborhood community center, helping prepare for the annual fall fundraiser that brought together families, local businesses, and university students. Noah had signed up through the hospital outreach program, and I joined without hesitation. We spent the first hour arranging tables, hanging simple decorations, and unpacking boxes of donated books for the charity sale. It was ordinary work, yet somehow doing even the smallest tasks together always felt meaningful. "Can you hand me the blue ribbon?" Noah asked while decorating one of the display tables. Without looking, I reached directly into the supply box and passed him exactly what he needed. "You did not even check the colors," he said with an amused smile. I laughed. "You always choose blue. You remember everything. I learned from the best." Emily arrived a few minutes later carrying several trays of homemade cookies. She paused beside us with a knowing grin before setting everything on the refreshment table. "You two are impossible," she teased. "What did we do this time?" I asked. "Nothing unusual," she replied. "That is exactly the point." She gestured toward us with a playful smile. "One of you asks for something before the other already has it ready. One of you looks tired before the other quietly brings coffee. Neither of you seems to notice anymore." Noah exchanged a quick glance with me before smiling. "Maybe we have practiced." Emily laughed softly. "That is not something people practice. That is something people become." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away to greet more volunteers. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself paying attention to the countless tiny habits we shared. Noah automatically carried the heavier boxes while I organized the smaller decorations. I reminded him to take a short break after several busy hours because I recognized the familiar signs of exhaustion on his face before he admitted feeling tired. He quietly placed a bottle of water beside me without interrupting my conversation because he knew I often forgot to drink enough while concentrating on a project. None of those gestures were dramatic. None demanded attention. They simply reflected years of learning each other's rhythms until caring had become as natural as breathing. As the fundraiser came to an end, families gathered outside beneath rows of glowing string lights, while local musicians played gentle acoustic songs in the cool evening air. Noah and I stood together watching children laugh as they carried handmade lanterns across the courtyard. "This was a good day," I said quietly. "It really was," Noah agreed. I smiled as I looked around at our friends, my family, and the neighbors chatting comfortably nearby. Not once had I worried about whether anyone was watching us. Instead, I realized something much more important. The happiness I felt no longer depended on protecting a secret. It came from knowing that the people surrounding us cared far more about our smiles than about labels or explanations. Noah gently looked toward me with the same calm expression that had steadied my heart so many times before. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I smiled back without hesitation. "I think we spent too long believing love becomes safer when it stays hidden." I glanced around at the familiar faces filling the courtyard before meeting his eyes once more. Now I finally understand that the people who truly love us never needed the secret to disappear. They only wanted to see us happy enough to stop carrying it alone. Late autumn gradually gave way to the first cool mornings of early winter, and with the changing season came a comforting rhythm that neither Noah nor I ever tried to change. We still met whenever our schedules allowed. Sometimes before my morning classes, sometimes after his long hospital shifts, and sometimes for nothing more than a short walk through the neighborhood before heading home. Looking back, I realized that the happiest parts of our relationship had never been built from extraordinary moments. They had always been hidden inside ordinary days that slowly became unforgettable simply because we shared them together. One Saturday afternoon, my parents invited everyone over for an early holiday dinner. Noah arrived carrying a homemade apple pie that he insisted was only acceptable because the recipe came from his grandmother. My mother laughed as soon as she opened the front door. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "every year you bring something homemade, and every year you pretend it is not impressive." Noah smiled modestly. I have had a very good teacher. My mother accepted the pie before giving him a grateful hug. Watching the two of them together felt completely natural, as though Noah had quietly become part of every family tradition without anyone needing to announce it. Dinner unfolded with the familiar mix of laughter, stories, and playful debates that always filled our dining room. My father proudly described his latest woodworking project. My mother insisted everyone take another helping of roasted vegetables, and Liam entertained us with a story about accidentally locking himself out of his apartment. Throughout the evening, Noah and I slipped effortlessly into the same quiet rhythm we had always shared. He reached for the serving bowl before I realized it was almost empty. I poured him another glass of water before he noticed his was gone. We thanked each other without thinking, smiled without explanation, and continued enjoying the conversation. Halfway through dessert, my mother looked around the table with a thoughtful expression before laughing softly to herself. "Can I admit something?" she asked. Everyone looked toward her with curious smiles. "Of course," Liam replied. She rested her hands around her coffee mug before looking first at Noah, then at me. "When you boys first started insisting that you were just very close friends, I believed you." I nearly dropped my fork. Noah blinked in quiet surprise beside me. My mother continued with a gentle smile. "But after a while, I stopped paying attention to what either of you said." My father nodded knowingly. "We started paying attention to what you did instead." I looked from one familiar face to another, completely speechless. Liam laughed. "Welcome to the conversation the rest of us have quietly been having for years." My mother reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Every time Noah walked into a room, you relaxed before he even spoke. Every time you laughed, he looked happier than anyone else. Every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner, you found each other without thinking." She smiled with unmistakable affection. Parents notice those things. I felt my eyes grow warm, not because I was embarrassed, but because every word was filled with kindness instead of judgment. Noah quietly reached beneath the table and lightly brushed the back of my hand with his fingertips for a brief moment before returning both hands to his lap. It was such a small gesture that years ago I would have worried someone might notice. Now it simply felt honest. My father raised his coffee mug with a smile. "The best part," he said, "is that none of us were waiting for you to explain yourselves. We were simply waiting for the day you both looked this peaceful." As warm laughter filled the room once again, I realized that love had never changed the people sitting around this table. It had only given all of us another reason to be grateful for the family we had quietly become together. Winter settled gently over the city, covering familiar streets with crisp mornings and clear blue skies that seemed brighter after every snowfall. Life continued moving forward, yet the quiet happiness Noah and I had discovered never faded into the background. Instead, it became part of every ordinary day, woven into routines that once seemed too simple to notice. I finished another demanding week of architecture classes while Noah balanced long hospital shifts with the same patience and steady kindness that had always defined him. Even when our schedules barely overlapped, we found small ways to stay connected. A handwritten note tucked inside my backpack before class. A warm cup of coffee waiting outside the hospital after his evening shift. A short phone call before bed just to hear each other's voices for a few minutes. None of those moments were dramatic, but together they created a life that felt wonderfully complete. One Saturday morning, Noah suggested visiting the small outdoor holiday market that appeared in the town square every December. Wooden booths lined the streets beneath strings of white lights, while local musicians played familiar winter songs. Families browsed handmade gifts, children laughed around a towering evergreen tree, and the smell of hot chocolate and cinnamon drifted through the cold air. We wandered from booth to booth without any particular plan, stopping whenever something caught our attention. Noah found a craftsman carving wooden ornaments by hand, while I spent several minutes admiring sketchbooks made from recycled paper. "You are thinking about buying one," Noah said with a smile before I even spoke. I laughed softly. "How do you always know?" "Because every time you find a blank notebook, you imagine the buildings you might draw inside it." I smiled, realizing he was exactly right. I bought the sketchbook, and Noah quietly purchased a carved maple leaf ornament without telling me why. We continued walking until we reached the center of the square, where a community choir had gathered beneath the large holiday tree. People stood shoulder to shoulder listening to the music, smiling at complete strangers who happened to be sharing the same peaceful afternoon. Emily, Marcus, Liam, and my parents waved when they spotted us across the crowd, inviting us to join them. We slipped naturally into the group, laughing as everyone shared warm drinks and exchanged small gifts. At one point, my mother noticed the ornament Noah was holding and asked if it was for the family tree. Noah smiled and placed it gently in her hands. I thought it would look nice beside the others. She looked at the carefully carved leaf for a moment before her eyes softened with gratitude. "It will," she replied warmly, "because every year tells part of our family's story." Standing there among the people who had quietly supported us all along, I realized how much had changed since the day Noah and I believed we needed to hide our happiness. No speeches had been necessary. No grand announcements had ever happened. Life had simply continued, and the people who loved us welcomed every new chapter as naturally as they had welcomed every chapter before it. As snowflakes began drifting gently through the evening sky, Noah looked toward me with the same calm smile that first made me feel safe years earlier. I looked back at him and understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. Love is rarely revealed in one unforgettable moment. More often, it quietly appears through kindness repeated every day until it becomes impossible to imagine life without it. Surrounded by family, friends, and the warmth of an ordinary winter evening, I knew our story had never been defined by a secret. It had always been defined by the people who recognized our happiness long before we finally learned to recognize it ourselves. 1 year later, the first warm days of spring brought us back to the same botanical garden where so many ordinary afternoons had quietly shaped our lives. The flowers were beginning to bloom again. The trees had traded their winter branches for fresh green leaves, and the familiar walking paths looked almost exactly the way they had when Noah and I still believed we were carefully hiding our relationship from the world. We walked side by side at an unhurried pace, stopping every now and then to admire flowers that neither of us could name, but both of us appreciated anyway. I carried the sketchbook I had purchased during the winter market, now filled with drawings of buildings, gardens, coffee shops, and little moments that had become part of our story. Noah smiled as I flipped through the pages. "You finished it," he said. "Almost," I replied. "There is still one page left." He looked curious but did not ask why. That was one of the things I admired most about him. He always gave me room to arrive at my own thoughts before asking questions. We eventually reached the same wooden bridge overlooking the quiet pond where Liam had gently revealed that our family had understood the truth long before we did. I rested my arms on the railing and watched the sunlight dance across the water. "Do you remember what you told me here?" I asked. Noah smiled softly. "I have said a lot of things here." I laughed. "You said that the only people who did not know how much we cared about each other were the two people standing on the bridge." Noah nodded, his eyes warm with quiet amusement. I still think that was true. I opened my sketchbook to the final blank page and handed it to him. Instead of another architectural drawing, I had written a single sentence across the center of the paper in careful handwriting. Some stories are never hidden. They are simply waiting for the right people to recognize them. Noah read the words slowly before looking back at me with the same gentle expression that had become my favorite place in the world. "That sounds like you," he said. I shook my head with a smile. "It sounds like us." We continued walking until we reached the small cafe near the garden entrance where we had shared countless cups of coffee over the years. The owner greeted us with a cheerful smile before preparing our usual orders without asking. As she placed the cups on the table, she laughed softly. "You two still order exactly the same way." Noah glanced at me with playful satisfaction. "Some traditions are worth keeping." After she walked away, I looked around the cafe at families talking, students studying, and elderly couples sharing quiet conversations by the windows. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow that ordinary feeling had become the greatest gift our journey had given me. I no longer searched every room wondering who might notice us. I no longer worried about whether someone might guess what had always been true. I simply enjoyed the life we were building together, one ordinary day at a time. As the afternoon sunlight filled the cafe, I reached for my coffee at exactly the same moment Noah slid the sugar closer because he already knew I would want it. We both laughed before either of us said a word. Some habits had become part of who we were, and neither of us wished to change them. Looking back across every conversation, every quiet walk, every shared meal, and every gentle moment that brought us here, I finally understood the lesson our journey had been teaching from the very beginning. Love does not become meaningful because it is hidden, and it does not become stronger because it is finally seen. It becomes unforgettable because it grows patiently through trust, kindness, and countless ordinary moments until the people living it realize they have been home in each other all along. As Noah and I stepped outside beneath the bright spring sky and continued down the familiar garden path together, I smiled knowing that the most beautiful chapter of our story was never the secret we thought we were protecting. It was the quiet, enduring happiness we found when we finally stopped hiding it from ourselves.